Hi, welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Every week, I answer a question submitted by one of you, our BMFI patrons. If you have a question you'd like me to try to answer, film related of course, please visit the Ask Andrew section of Film Studies Online at brynmarfilm.org. On to today's question. Jerry asks, why were romantic comedies so popular in the 1990s? Why aren't they as popular today? Well, Jerry, I don't know if I can entirely accept the premise of your question. I will fully grant you that Hollywood doesn't make as many romantic comedies now as it did in the 1990s, but I think Hollywood, meaning the major studios and even sort of the major independents, don't make as many movies of any kind as they did in the 1990s. So I think the movies are still being made. I think that there are fewer of them, as there are fewer of every genre, save perhaps superhero or other big budget franchises. I think there are some other factors as well, though. One thing to consider is that the genre of the romantic comedy might have found a home elsewhere besides the film made for theatrical release. If you look at some of the sort of biggest, most high-profile romantic comedies released in the last few years, they were made for Netflix, or they were made for Amazon or by Amazon. Granted, some of those got theatrical releases, but they weren't made by Hollywood per se, as we tend to think of it. So some of this is that the romantic comedies have moved to streaming services. They tend to be a very modestly priced genre of feature film to make, so that would be one reason for the appeal there. You'll also notice that Hollywood studios aren't very often in the business of making, at least not over the last several years, making low budget to mid-range budget films. They tend to make either movies that are really, really inexpensive or movies that are enormously expensive. And the sort of mid-range movie, which a rom-com with two popular stars, at least their salaries certainly would have made it, a mid-range budget, that's not really much what they tend to do anymore. There are other places that the romantic comedy can be found, by the way, not just streaming services. Look on television. I think Hallmark makes a ton of romantic comedy movies. I think Lifetime makes romantic comedy movies. And a number of other sort of, more broad cable channels like Freeform and channels like that. So again, it's something, much more manageable in terms of feature film genres. It's a much more manageable one for relatively modestly resourced entities, whether they are film production houses or studios or television networks to make. I do think we see a fair number of romantic comedies come out of the independent world, but they tend to not be sort of in the conventional mold of Hollywood rom-coms of the 90s, either based on the sort of an unconventional, nature of the relationship or, different backgrounds of the characters or wanting different things than sort of ending up as a happy couple as romantic comedies in the 90s in Hollywood tended to have happen. I think that the notion of who makes or what is a romantic couple, to put the romantic and romantic comedy, has obviously greatly expanded in terms of Hollywood's view of the world and in terms of a lot of, the American public's view of the world. And so I think you start to see romantic comedies being made that have different types of relationships and different types of people in those relationships. So those might not seem to be sort of the same mold as those Hollywood was making in the 90s with Sandra Bullock and Hugh Grant and Meg Ryan and whoever. But they're sort of the natural heir to it. I mean, the genres change over time, and where they can be found changes over time as well. I mean, what we think of the romantic comedy from the 90s, whether it's When Harry Met Sally or, 2 Weeks Notice or whatever, is really a descendant of the screwball comedy of the 30s and 40s, which had much more of a class component to it and much harder edges to its view of gender difference, certainly. And from there, you can sort of draw a line to the completely, sort of fluffy romantic comedies of Rock Hudson and Doris Day, right through to, Woody Allen making a movie like Annie Hall in the 70s, which is, a romantic comedy, one that doesn't end up with the couple together, but there's really no other way to look at it. And so the genre changes over time. The view of what is romance changes over time. I think the biggest obstacle to the types of movies you sort of allude to, at least implicitly in your question, has to do with, changing views of gender and the differences between the sexes and things like that. There are, whether it's Me Too or whether it's, aspects of sort of, equal opportunity in culture and in society and in corporations and before the law and all that. There is right now sort of less of a sense of humor about the sort of quote unquote differences between men and women. I doubt it will always be that way, but for the last handful of years, we've certainly been in that cultural moment, and that doesn't lend itself to these sorts of movies, I think, to be sure. But I think there are people making them. I think there are people making them about people whose disagreements come from being from different, cultures and different countries. And we're seeing a lot more diversity in the romantic comedies that are being made in the sort of traditional studio system as well as outside of it. And that's a good thing. And so I think the movies are still there. I think you just might need to look at them a little differently and look for them in some different places as well. Thanks for the question. And thank you for watching this edition of Ask Andrew. If you have a film-related question you'd like to see if I can answer, please submit it via the Ask Andrew forum in the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org.